Thank you, Professor Lane, I think, for giving me this opportunity to chair this session. And thank you, Bombay Ophthalmologist Association, as well as Maharashtra Ophthalmology Society for this opportunity. I think it's time to start the session. So let me welcome all the chair and co-chair. We have Dr. Chandrasekhar with us, Dr. Vijaya, Dr. Reema, Dr. Upadhyay, and Dr. Modawala in the chairs. And we have six very interesting topics in this session, and each topic will have it's kind of a debates. So each topic will have two speakers, pro and against, and one discussant. So thank you everyone for joining in, and I'll hand over the mic uh, to Dr. Upadhyay. You're uh, moderating the session, so over to Dr. Upadhyay for the proceedings.
Good
Welcome
evening.
everyone once again. Thank you.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Lane sir, Ragini madam, and my seniors over here. This is the last session for day, but believe me, we reserved the best for the last. Yeah, we'll have debates. So our first debate of the day would be on pre-perimetric glaucoma, to treat or not to. We have Dr. Karishma Chavan who would be speaking for to treat, and Dr. Pankaj would speak in the opinion to observe. Dr. Karishma, can you please start? You've got 6 minutes.
Yeah. Very good evening. I'll just share my screen.
Karishma, I'll be maintaining timing and I'll let you know when you are close to 6 minutes, all right?
Okay, yeah. Just give me 2 minutes. I'll just start
Sure.
my screen. Is the screen visible?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. I'll start. Yeah. A very good evening. At the outset, I would like to thank BOA and MOS for giving me this opportunity. My topic for today is pre-perimetric glaucoma in favor of treating my patients. So we know pre-perimetric glaucoma is the presence of characteristic optic disc fiber layer changes that strongly suggest glaucoma, but without field defects on conventional white-on-white perimetry. Just a minute, it's not moving. Yeah. So my first point of discussion is a normal perimetry really normal? So Asoka et al. Compared visual fields from pre-perimetric eyes to healthy eyes and found significant sensitivity loss was present, particularly in the nasal step and the Jerem's area. Because there is considerable overlap in the receptive fields of retinal ganglion cells, there is redundancy in the coverage of a given location in the retina. Therefore, a non-selective test of visual function, such as an automated perimetry, may not be sensitive for very early loss of retinal ganglion cells. We also know that around 25 to 35% of retinal ganglion cells would need to be lost for an abnormality on conventional perimetry, suggesting an early disease. There was another cohort of patients that was studied in the diagnostic innovations in glaucoma study, and they found that a combination of test types may be more efficient in identifying early loss and confirming the area of the retina affected by glaucoma. So I think in a clinical practice, it doesn't really, it's not feasible and not even possible to subject a patient of this suspect to an FDT and a swab and maybe a CETA or a full threshold all at the same time. SAP uses a log decibel scale, which compresses data in the early stages of disease, making it really relatively insensitive to retinal ganglion cell loss in early disease. My second point, which I would like to put forth is only perimetry enough for glaucoma diagnosis? Or in other words, should I put it as, is glaucoma diagnosis based only on perimetry? Is clinical findings, OCT, HRT, and other supplemental tests useful? So I think, yes, they are useful. The Diagnostic Innovation Glaucoma Study is a longitudinal study that has been analyzing best methods to detect early glaucoma, progression, and effect on daily visual function and quality of life. So they studied that their patients with suspected glaucoma with baseline RNFL atrophy had a fourfold increased risk of developing perimetric disease during follow-up. And those whose optic nerve showed glaucomatous progression over time had a 26-fold increased risk of developing visual field. So I think we really cannot neglect if we find any changes in our OCT. Also, confocal scanning laser ophthalmoscopy ancillary study of OHDS showed the risk for developing abnormal visual field was increased 9-fold in eyes with abnormal baseline optic disc topography. Ocular hypertension treatment study 2 of the 5 described risk factors for converting to glaucoma, that is increased cup disc ratio and visual field pattern standard deviation, are nothing but surrogates of preperimetric glaucoma. So if you have a patient in a clinic with an increased cup disc ratio, we do not really know whether we are seeing him at a point of time which was stable, the optic disc was stable for all these years, or it is in the spectrum of an ongoing disease. High-risk ocular hypertension treatment study patients have a risk of 25 to 35% over 5 years for developing glaucoma. Eye drop treatment reduced the development of glaucoma by more than 50%. My third point is that yes, we do have evidence to treat our preperimetric open-angle glaucoma patients. And in fact, those patients with disc hemorrhage and insufficient IOP should be carefully monitored for further risk of progression. As ophthalmologists, we not only want to maintain the vision, but also preserve the quality of life of our patients. Most of our ophthalmologists feel that the quality of life deteriorates once the patient has advanced glaucoma or the patient is partially blind. But I beg to differ that vision-related quality of life in glaucoma suspect or early glaucoma patients is also reduced, particularly for distance activities, driving, and color vision. Even collaborative initial glaucoma treatment study at enrollment, more than 25% of newly diagnosed glaucoma patients reported blurred vision, difficulty in adapting between light and dark environments, trouble seeing in dark, and problems with bright light. But the good news is that in preperimetric glaucoma, this vision-related quality of life is not impaired. So here we have a window of opportunity where we can treat our patients when they have just a structural loss and no visual field damage. So I would just like to conclude by saying that early glaucoma can undermine quality of life, and these changes cannot be reflected in traditional test data. It's not about IOP reduction, but about IOP modulation, where we want to blunt the effect of IOP peaks and IOP fluctuation. No treatment improves quality of life, I agree partly, but yes, and definitely I think it reduces deterioration. We have many safe one-time dosing preservative-free medications available, and I would therefore err on the side of caution and treat my patient. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karishma, for maintaining the time.
Thank you.
Dr. Pankaj, can you please go ahead with your talk, please?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'll share my screen. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, my slides are visible.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Okay. So preperimetric glaucoma, to treat or not to treat. So I will debate on observe side. So by definition, glaucoma requires definite disc changes and corresponding visual field changes. Till then, it is either ocular hypertension or glaucoma suspect. Now, ocular hypertension is IOP more than 21, no detectable visual field loss, no detectable optic nerve, optic disc or nerve fiber layer damage, open angles, and no ocular or systemic cause for increased IOP. Now, the OSTS study had this primary goals to evaluate the safety and efficacy of topical ocular hypertensive medications in delaying or preventing the development of POH in individuals with elevated IOP. So that was the OSTS entry criteria, age between 40 to 80 with normal visual fields, normal optic disc, and untreated IOP in one eye between 24 to 32 and 21 to 32 in the fellow eye. Now, this phase 1 of OSTS started in 1994 with the eligibility criteria which I just mentioned, and patients were randomized into medication group and observation group. Medication group, the IOP was lowered by 20%, and observation groups, no topical medications were given, and they were monitored serially with Humphreys perimeter and the stereoscopic disc photograph. Whenever there is a reproducible abnormality like 3 consecutive visual fields or 2 consecutive optic disc photographs showing RNFL loss for disc hemorrhage masked by 2 observers, and then that was called as the endpoint when the case was labeled as converted into POAG. Now, this was the baseline characteristic with the IOP of 24.9 was the average IOP in the OSTS studies. So now this OSTS phase 1 had a cumulative proportion of developing POAG by race, and the data analysis shows 12.7% of POAG endpoints in the observation group in African Americans, 6.9% POAG endpoints in the medication groups with a hazard ratio of 0.54. For others, it was 10.2 POAG endpoints in observation group and 3.6 in the medication groups. Here, p-value was not significant. Now, OSTS phase 1 summary shows medication reduced the IOP of 20% from the baseline, and medication reduced the incidence of POAG in OST participants from 9.5% in the observation group to 4% in the medication group. So definitely it has reduced the risk of development of glaucoma by 50%, from 9.5% in observation group to 4.4% in the medication group. But there was few questions that remain unanswered with OSTS 1. So that's why OSTS 2 was started. OSTS 1 phase 1 gave us the proof of concept that medication slightly reduces the incidence of POAG, but it does not indicate when medication should begin. OSTS phase 1 does not indicate if all the OST patients should receive early medication, and is there any penalty by delaying the medication, whether patients is having any penalty to pay by delaying the medication. So with that rationale, OSTS phase 2 was started in 2002. Now the original group which was on medication was continued on the medication, and the other group which was on observation, now that was also started on the medication. Now OSTS phase 2, after the 7.5 years of observation, the participants which were originally randomized to observation group now were started on the medication. So this created two groups in OSTS 2, OSTS phase 2, delayed treatment group and early treatment group. So now delayed treatment group was the observation group followed for 7.5 years and then treated for 5.5 years. And early treatment group was the medication group treated for a median of 13 years from the beginning. Now all this data was analyzed after 13 years. Now OSTS phase 1 showed the incidence of POAG is nearly 60% lower in the medication group, where hazard ratio was 0.4. Now OSTS phase 2 showed that incidence of POAG is not different between the observation and the medication group, with hazard ratio of 1.06. Now this is the one important chart that shows the cumulative 13-year incidence of POAG in low, medium and high risk groups. Now in the first chart, it shows for the low risk OSTs, medication group developed 7% developed glaucoma endpoints and observation 8% with p-value not significant. In the middle risk medication group, 14% developed POAG and observation 19% p-value not significant. It was only the highest risk category patients where medication group developed 28% and observation group developed 40% as a POAG endpoints. Here only the p-value is significant. So not across all risk. It is only the highest risk category that shows the benefit. So here the conclusion is that most low risk OST patients can be followed without medication. Delaying treatment for 7.5 years resulted in only small absolute increase in the POAG in the low risk participants. Starting treatment when POAG is confirmed has no major negative effect on the prognosis over 5 years periods. So high risk OST patient may benefit from more frequent examination and early treatment consideration. Early treatment taking into consideration patient age, health status, life expectancy, family history, personal preference. Now OCT RNFL analysis and fundus photograph, anything showing a very definite conclusive evidence of glaucoma, and then putting the patients on the treatment. OSTs obviously had some limitation where IOP reduction was only 20%, which may not be sufficient in all the cases. No measure for medication adherence, convenience sample, not population-based epidemiology study. High threshold for diagnosing POAG. Now we have better testing modality available, as Madam was saying about HRT, OCT, and other things where we can very confidently diagnose pre-perimetric glaucomas. So in summary, individualized assessment of risk is the best course of action. Absolute beneficial effect of treatment is greatest only in high-risk individual. There is little absolute benefit of early treatment in all the OST or pre-perimetric glaucoma patients. So I feel rather than treating everyone, stress on timely visit, appropriate test during the follow-up, risk status will change over a period of time. Patient education is the key, but don't overtreat all the OST patients as of that is not a evidence and that is not the right economics also. Thank you.
Dr. Pankaj, do we have Pratik, sir? Dr. Pratik?
Yeah, very much.
Yeah, sir. Good evening, sir. Please share your opinion with us, please. Because it will be open, the topic will be open for discussion in the end, but right now we'll take opinion from Dr. Pratik. Yes, please.
Okay, so congratulations to both the speakers. They did wonderful job. And if Dr. Pando asks me to vote, then I will give one vote to Karishma and one vote to Pankaj. But I'm not allowed to give two votes. So now let me put my point. You know, if you are diagnosing a condition, pre-perimetric glaucoma, that means a pathology. Okay. So any pathology you cannot leave untreated until and unless if there is a more risk of treating the patient rather than the benefit. So if you feel that the patient will be benefited by the treatment, then we must treat. If we feel that the patient would not be benefited by treatment, then we should not treat. So obviously all pre-perimetric glaucoma, I'm sorry to say that the Pankaj has concentrated more on the ocular hypertension, and ocular hypertension is a different condition than the pre-perimetric glaucoma. Probably, you know, he might have taken more help of the early manifest glaucoma trial, which might have fit more into the pre-perimetric glaucoma. But anyway, whatever it is, if you have a patient of a pre-perimetric glaucoma, a true pre-perimetric glaucoma, where you are able to visualize the optic nerve changes and the RNFL defect. And there are some risk factors, like patient is of young age. Damaging IOP means the IOP at the presentation is very high. If there is a disc hemorrhage, if there is a strong family history of glaucoma, all these patients that deserve treatment. On the contrary, if you have a patient who have a little lower IOP and age is 75 years old, he might have a little scotoma as well, more than pre-perimetric glaucoma. Then also probably I may not treat that patient and I would do the serial follow-up. So most important thing is that you have to decide which group requires a treatment and which group does not require a treatment. And for both the groups, the most important thing is do a serial follow-up. If you are decided not to treat, if you are doing the serial follow-up, and whenever you pick up progression, you must initiate the treatment. Do not delay the treatment. Okay. So I don't know how much time I have.
That's fine, sir. If you want to make any other point, you can make.
Okay. So the central cornea thickness is again one of the important things which we must consider. Higher the intraocular pressure, thinner is the cornea. Patient is having a pre-perimetric glaucoma. We must consider the patient for the treatment. Similarly, high myopic patient, they also present with a similar kind of a situation, and then you may consider them for treating these patients. So the crux is that apply a holistic approach, examine the patient thoroughly, decide which patient require a treatment, which patient does not require a treatment, and most important, do the serial follow-up of the patient.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So we go on to the next debate of this session. Although it's the last session, it's like the last 15 overs of a 5th-day test match, like what we had in the GABA 4 months ago. So it's as exciting and everybody is as awake as ever. And there's the beauty about glaucoma. You can have various opinions by various surgeons and all may be right to reach the ultimate goal of giving a patient a satisfactory visual outcome. So our next topic is on one failed trabeculectomy, what now? Which will be a repeat trabeculectomy, which will be spoken by Dr. Chanda Hingorani. Trab or a valve implant will be by Dr. Ajit Hazari, and it will be discussed at the end by Dr. Harsh Kumar. So 6 minutes to the speakers. I'll be maintaining your timing, and Dr. Chanda, you can please start sharing your screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayur. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Manish Shah, BOA and MOS for giving me this opportunity. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, it can be seen now. You can maximize it and start.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk in favor of repeat trabeculectomy. So trabeculectomy, we all know, still remains the gold standard filtering surgery, having a good success rate of about 70 to 88%. However, this surgery has a limited lifespan and it may fail over a period of time. So the dilemma is, what if a primary trabeculectomy surgery fails? We have two options, either do a repeat trabeculectomy or put in a tube. However, before we decide what to do next, it is very important to understand why the primary surgery failed. So in case the reason for failure of the primary trabeculectomy surgery was poor patient selection, that is, if the primary trab was done in patients with complicated secondary glaucomas, like all these patients with extensive conjunctival scarring, silicone oil-induced glaucoma, uveitic glaucoma, glaucoma secondary to keratoplasty, I think there is no point in going for a repeat trabeculectomy because it is not going to work and tube is the procedure of choice. However, if the initial trabeculectomy surgery was done in an uncomplicated eye with primary glaucomas, and if despite all the measures, the blood cannot be revised, then repeat trabeculectomy definitely is the treatment of choice. Why do a repeat trabeculectomy? We know that this is one glaucoma surgery that have stood the test of time. And with rigorous and careful patient selection, it has a very good success rate. So coming to the advantages of repeat trabeculectomy, this is a relatively easy procedure to perform, does not require any special training. And most of the general ophthalmologists are well trained and skilled to perform this procedure. It has a shorter surgical time compared to tube shunts. It is a less messy surgery. There is less bleeding, less tissue dissection. So we all know that trabeculectomy does not require any fancy, expensive equipments. So in a country like India, where there are a lot of financial constraints, I think trap is a very economically viable option compared to the tube, where the cost of tube itself can be burdensome for the patient. With repeat trap, we have the option of reviving a failed bleb. There are multiple options. We can do bleb needling, releasable or adjustable sutures, laser suturolysis, 5FU injections. Whereas if a tube fails, there is nothing much that can be done. There is limited data available for the success of needle revision after tube surgery. This is the biggest advantage of doing a repeat trap. We all know that glaucoma surgeries don't last forever. So it is very important to anticipate and prepare for subsequent procedures. This is particularly important in younger patients who may need a sequence of operations over their lifespan. So if we are doing a repeat trap, only a small amount of conjunctiva is lost, and there is still a scope of doing tube in future. But if a tube fails, there is not enough conjunctiva left to consider for a trap. So this makes tube a potentially dead end procedure. With trap, it is possible to get IOPs in single digit, whereas with tubes, the IOP generally settles down somewhere in the high teens. So in case in a patient where the target IOP is 10 or below, then repeat trap definitely is the procedure of choice. In patients who cannot use anti-glaucoma medications either due to intolerance or any other issues like that, then repeat trap again is the procedure of choice because there is greater likelihood of achieving a complete medicine-free success with trabeculectomy rather than a tube surgery. Also, unlike tube, there is no hypertensive phase with trap, hence there is no need of anti-glaucoma drops post-surgery. With retrap, there are no unacceptable side effects of tubes like corneal decompensation secondary to tube touch, tube exposure and erosions, cosmetically disfiguring blebs, tube and plate displacements, and diplopia and motility issues. So I'll quickly go through few studies about repeat trap. So this was a study published in IGO in January 2019 about the surgical outcomes of repeat trabeculectomy augmented with high dose mitomycin C. And the study concluded that repeat trap with mitomycin C used in higher concentration and exposure time altered according to the individual risk factor plays a crucial role in the success, and hence it could be considered a viable option before planning a tube surgery. So this is a very important point when we are planning to do a repeat trap. A proper patient selection and a proper titration of the dose of mitomycin C is very important for the success of this procedure. This is another study which was published in Korean Journal of Ophthalmology in 2011, comparing the outcome of repeat trap with MMC and initial trabeculectomy. Again, this study concluded that repeat trap with MMC has a high success and low complication rate in patients with previously failed trap. Yet another study published in BGO in March 2017 to see the long-term outcomes of repeat trabeculectomy. And this study concluded that repeat trap with mitomycin C is a safe and effective procedure in the medium to long term. And in this study, at 60 months post repeat trap, a qualified success was achieved in 75.6% of the patient, which is quite a good figure. This is one of my patient repeat trap. So a combined surgery was done, cataract plus trap, in February 2014, which eventually failed. I did a repeat trap in January 2017. Followed by a bleb needling in February 2017. Patient is still maintaining after 4 years an IOP between 12 and 16 millimeter without any supplemental anti-glaucoma medication. So this is the failed primary bleb. I did a nasal trabeculectomy. You can see a diffuse filtering bleb. So I still have intact temporal conjunctiva for future tube if it is needed. What counts in glaucoma surgery is scoring with efficacy. And only with a repeat trabeculectomy, we can get significantly lower IOPs with less side effects. So I think repeat trabeculectomy definitely is the procedure of choice. Thank you everyone for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. That was very eloquently put. Although I hope the easy peasy, which was there in one of your slides for trap, holds true for my surgeries as well, which I'm not too sure of. Dr. Ajit, can you please start sharing your screen, please, for the valve implant?
Dr. Chandrasekhar, sir. Right. Are my slides visible?
Yes, sir, you're visible, you're audible, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, BOA, MOS, Dr. Lahane, Ragini ma'am, Manish, Jinish, and Mayav for inviting me in this session. And thank you so much to Dr. Chanda for covering all the points so well. She's made my talk so much more easier, and my talk almost becomes like a complimentary talk to hers. So considering a tube after a failed trab is what I'm going to talk about. Now, if you look at the common indications for tube, the most obvious one is an eye with a previous surgery, like a failed trab, where there is conjunctival scarring, and there may be presence of inflammation in the eye. Other than that, as Dr. Chanda already referred to, the refractory glaucomas, which have compromised conjunctiva and increased inflammation, like the post-traumatic, uveitic, uncontrolled neovascular disease. These are the these are the situations where a trab is very, very likely to fail. Why to prefer a tube surgery after a failed trab? The chances of failure in a repeat trab are more if there is presence of scarred conjunctiva and increased inflammatory mediators. The TVT study is a landmark study, and despite all its limitations of the implant being used and the type of patients that were used, it showed that the failure rate of tube is half of that of a repeat trab with mitomycin C over a long period of time. What does the real world experience show us? Now, we've been using tubes for a long, long time, and we've learned a lot about trabeculectomy, wound healing, and the way trabeculectomy fares over a period of time, as well as the tubes over the last 10, 15 years at least. And the same surgery, what we all know is that the same surgery, either being a trab or a tube, despite all the standardizations, has different outcomes at the hands of different surgeons, and can have different outcomes at the hands of the same surgeon, but in different patients, in different eyes. So what I firmly believe is that a skilled surgeon should have both surgeries in his armamentarium and choose the technique that works best in his hands for that particular eye. Having said that, we all know from history and what we've learned from our clinical practice over so many years and all the studies that show that repeat trabeculectomy has a lower chance of survival as compared to a trabeculectomy done in a virgin eye. If we look at the glaucoma surgeries and compare them on the basis of efficacy, that is the potential to reduce IOP, and the safety, that is the incidence of complications or the need for interventions, then trabeculectomy scores at the top at reducing the IOP, and at the other extreme is MIGS. But if you look at the safety, that is less complications and less interventions required, then the sequence is exactly the opposite, where mitomycin, the trab mitomycin C has the highest potential of causing hypotony and serious hypotony for that matter. So what are the surgical considerations after a failed trab? I'll be talking about the tube. So the challenges that we face in using tubes in our patients in our patients is that it involves a relatively steep learning curve. But my personal belief is this is more so because we are less familiar with the surgery. And the solution is an early hands-on training during residency or fellowship, and that will definitely go a long way. Then the tube always requires the availability of scleral patch graft. Whether you use it or not use it, a different issue. But even that is not so much of a challenge now because there are so many eye banks available who are ready to offer us a scleral patch. And the only thing that we need to do is plan in advance so that we have the scleral patch graft available with us at the time of surgery. Traditionally, the implants have always been much, much more expensive compared to a trab with mitomycin C. But the introduction of the RD and the modifications that we've been doing with it over the last 3-4 years has definitely reduced the cost of surgery for us. The distinct advantages of a tube are that it has a better survival rate over time than a repeat trab. And there are less chances of early complications such as hypotony and early surgical interventions. And of course, it is to be preferred in situations that we know which are more prone for failure of a primary trabeculectomy or a repeat trabeculectomy for that matter. So when should you prefer a tube after a failed trab? Well, the first thing is that all the efforts of reviving the old bleb are unsuccessful. Then obviously you don't have a choice but to operate. And if there is a definite extensive conjunctival scarring, there's inflammation, and there are conditions that predispose to refractory glaucoma, these again point towards using a tube. If the IOP is more than 25, then the TVT and PTVT studies have shown us that with a higher pre-op IOP, the chances of success of a tube are much more than a repeat trabeculectomy with mitomycin C. So as a closing remark, I mean, I don't want to go into the studies all over again, but I've taken the gist of what we've learned from the studies. So the closing remark is that even if you do a trab with mitomycin C in an eye which has a previously failed trab, it is probably wiser to leave the superotemporal quadrant free for a future tube implant. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very, very much. I would like to now request Dr. Harsh Kumar to give his viewpoints on this particular debate, please.
I think, like Prateep said, I have one mark to both of them. Both of Chanda was so good and eloquent. I don't think there was anything that she left out. And same with Ajit, very nicely he put all his points. But the hard fact in Indian population is that I think we will have to go for a retrap. All said and done, because not only the fact that, see, most of these people to you are not coming from your local area. A whole lot of these people are coming from outside. And let us be very frank, and I think Ajit did a very wise thing to say that we have to start teaching our people the valves at the standard level. Otherwise, they just don't know, and the general practitioner of ophthalmology does not have an idea. So let me give you a very important hint, which is more important than all the debate, that whenever you have done a valve and the valve goes outside somewhere, tell them to tell the doctor to pull down the lid or pull up the upper lid if it is there and see the valve. They just see the central area, forget to see the area of the tube gets exposed and they come back with endophthalmitis. So maybe you people are not doing that volumes. The volumes that come to me from complicated cases is enormous. And definitely the complications of valves are much, much more difficult to handle. And like Chanda rightly pointed out, that it's pretty much the dead end. Yes, we can sometimes do a second valve also. We can do a diode laser cyclophotocoagulation there also. But primarily, if you find that you had done a trab and the trab had failed because of the reason that probably you did not put enough mitomycin, probably you did not take out the sutures at the right time, probably there was a bleeding or something which can be redeemed, then you have to do a retrab. If there's an area which is available in the superior quadrant, then one must go for a retrab. Be careful in this retrab, though Chanda had told indirectly, you should increase your timing of the antifibrotics and you have to release the sutures earlier. You have to tell these people to come for a much more regular follow-up. And though Ajit rightly said, Chanda had very beautiful slide and she made it sound very, very simple. It is not many times a very simple surgery.
Yes.
But I think that is where it stands. And she rightly pointed out, yes, if you have done the trap for the wrong reason, like Ajit also showed that there are cases of PK and post-silicone oil removal and RD and secondary glaucomas, where anyway you should have done a valve in the first sitting. So I think the matter stands there. Each patient will have to be treated on its own merit. But classically, we should try for a trap first.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your valuable opinion. Now we have a third debate. There's a case of narrow angle glaucoma with cataract. We have Dr. Neeta Asher, who would prefer a YAG PI prior to the cataract. And we have Dr. Pooja Bomraj says no PI necessary. So let's go and hear both of them. Dr. Neeta, please go ahead.
My slides are visible?
Yeah, they are. Please go
Sure.
ahead.
Good evening, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank BOA and MOS team for giving me this opportunity. My topic for debate is narrow angle with cataract, and I will be speaking in favor of YAG PI that is YAC-PI, is indicated prior to cataract surgery. It is always wise to be well prepared in advance when you know the chances of bumpy ride ahead. We all know that eyes with PACG, they are functionally and anatomically different. They have flatter corneas, they have shorter axial lens, shallow anterior chamber, and they have thicker and relatively anteriorly positioned lenses. And this narrow anterior segment, which is seen in PACG eyes, is most often secondary to pupillary block. And this pupillary block component, if we can relieve by doing a laser iridotomy, an anterior segment can become deep enough to perform a safe intraocular procedure. We have enough evidence to show that there is anterior segment morphology changes after laser PI. As with anterior segment OCT images, we can see that after laser PI, there is definite increase in angle width, anterior chamber depth, and anterior chamber area. There is also flattening of the iris. Lens also shifts posteriorly after resolution of the attack, especially with greater lens wall. And all these changes, which are visible, studies have shown that these changes persist even months after the laser iridotomy. So why not take the advantage of these morphological changes after laser PI? Let us look at the difficulty which one faces while performing a phacoemulsification in narrow angles. You are working in a shallow anterior chamber with high intraocular pressure. There may be associated corneal clouding also, especially after acute attack. There may be floppy iris. This floppy iris with high intraocular pressure in a shallow anterior chamber can lead to repeated iris prolapse into the wound. There is a possibility of small pupil also in narrow angles. It can be because of chronic inflammation or because of chronic meiotic use, or there may be posterior synechia, which may be adherent to the lens capsule. Sometimes these eyes, they have zonular dialysis also. So all these factors, zonular dialysis or small pupil or iris prolapse, they make phacoemulsification difficult and requires repeated manipulation and extra tissue handling. We know when iris prolapses into the wound, it is very difficult to manage. Sometimes there is damage to the iris also because of repeated manipulation, and one may require a surgical iridectomy to handle this situation, which may be large enough to create a visual disturbance post-operatively. In contrast, after doing a laser iridotomy, anterior chamber becomes deep, iris remains in position throughout the cataract surgery, making phacoemulsification much more easier. Another alternative to this laser iridotomy may be use of intravenous mannitol, which can lead to vitreous shrinkage and a relatively deeper anterior chamber, but it may not be suitable for all patients, especially in elderly, when they are associated with cardiovascular or urological conditions. Another complication which is seen in narrow angles, although it is rare, but the possibility of malignant glaucoma is also there. Here, transient anterior chamber shallowing can precipitate aqueous misdirection, and it is recommended to avoid frequent anterior chamber shallowing and IOP fluctuations during cataract surgery. By doing a simple laser iridotomy, this anterior frequent chamber shallowing and IOP fluctuations can be avoided, and thus malignant glaucoma chances can also be minimized. So in summary, by considering all these factors, I agree in an experienced phacosurgeon, he can perform phacoemulsification alone without laser iridotomy in cases of occludable angles with normal intraocular pressure or with mild to moderate glaucomas when IOP is medically well controlled. But YAC-PI is certainly indicated in acute angle closure glaucoma, and one should relieve pupillary block by doing an iridotomy, and ideally a cataract surgery should be performed once inflammation subsides. It is also definitely indicated in nanophthalmos, and I will also recommend in all primary angle closure glaucoma with high intraocular pressure, as it reduces difficulties during phacoemulsification and thus reduces the chances of intraoperative as well as post-operative complications. Thank you so much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, doctor. Yeah. Dr. Pooja, can you please go ahead with your talk, please? Dr. Pooja, can you please go ahead? We can't hear you, please. Can you unmute yourself, please? You're showing mute. You need to unmute yourself, Dr. Pooja.
Yeah. I have unmuted. I am not able to share my screen. Just a minute. Sorry.
It's there on the screen, na? Share screen.
Yeah, it's there.
Green icon. Na? It's a green icon, Pooja.
Yeah.
Ah.
Is it seen now?
Yeah.
Sorry for the delay. Good evening, everyone. And I thank BOA and Dr. Manish sir for giving me this opportunity. This has been a really wonderful seminar all throughout the day. We have been listening to so many stalwart people. So I'll just go ahead with my talk, that is narrow angles with cataract, no PI necessary. So let's get the terminology clear. Actually, when we say narrow angles, that is primary angle closure suspect with normal IOP, no pass, no discharges, and no which was previously called as narrow or occludable angles. Also, in this situation, when there is more than 180 degrees of angle closure with raised IOP and pass, we say that is primary angle closure. And when there is associated glaucomatous changes, disc changes, and field changes, we say that it is primary angle closure, glaucoma. So we all know that glaucoma is multifactorial in nature, and Neetu also previously mentioned about all that details. But we need to understand that lens occupies almost 4 mm of space in the anterior segment, and it tends to increase in size over the life, like from 20, at the age of 20, if it is 4, as the age increases, it tends to increase in size and contributes significantly to the anatomical crowding in the anterior segment. When we are looking at the phacomorphic factor, there is increase in the lens thickness in cataractous lens. This leads to increase in iridolenticular contact and hence leads to pupillary block. This kind of pupillary block will not be treated by doing an YAC PI. Removing the lens will definitely solve our problem. So when we are looking at a case, 60-year-old patient with narrow angles, more than 180 degrees of angle closure, no pass, no significantly raised IOP, and there is visually significant cataract, no disc and field changes, obviously. Then we first do a gonio, confirm that the cause of angle closure is primary, it is not secondary, that is due to NVI or eye syndrome or something like that. Then we can straight away go ahead and do cataract surgery. When we do cataract and IOL implantation in this case, you can significantly see opening of the angles as seen in this slide. Also, when a 5 mm thick lens is replaced by a 0.72 mm thick, there is definite evidence of increased opening of the angle, decrease in the IOP, and visual rehabilitation. So we need to aim to treat the cause, not the effect. So when we are trying to do laser peripheral iodectomy in a case of angle closure glaucoma, especially with significant cataract, we are trying to treat the effect, not the cause. As has been described by various studies that have been done in recent time for angle closure. So decision to perform cataract surgery is clearly straightforward. When there is significant reduction in the IOP, especially in the angle closure group. There are multiple studies like Chen et al., Dr. Ravi Thomas et al., and Kim et al., where they have done studies of post-phacoemulsification results in glaucoma patients, and they have found out IOP reduction in the angle closure group as compared to the just open angle group. Recently, one study was published by Dr. Pando et al. In IGO in 2019, where they have studied the intraocular pressure reduction in the spectrum of angle closure disease. So all the patients of PACS, PAC, and PACG were included in the study. Patients with LPI, laser peripheral adectomy, were excluded from the study. They underwent cataract surgery with IOL implantation, and the patients were followed up for a period of 1 year. And over the period of 1 year, they found out that almost 23% of reduction in the IOP was found, and 37% reduction in the dependence of anti-glaucoma medication. So the benefits are very obvious. And laser peripheral iridectomy is not benign, totally benign. You might come across iritis after the procedure. There might be hyphema. You might damage the endothelium in the process. It might just accelerate the cataract, and also you might end up having an attack of angle closure after the PI. There might be a past development. There are reports which say that the angles fail to open up even in almost 30% of the cases after LPI. LPI is indicated in eyes with PAC and PACG in absence of cataract. So, and in addition to what I've already said, there were other trials also, ZAP trial and EAGLE study, which have repeatedly re-emphasized the importance of not doing PI in asymptomatic PSC, and also the importance of having cataract extraction. A cataract extraction with LPI should be our first option of treatment in patients with visually significant cataract, especially in PSCS. So to conclude, we can say that PSCS with cataract is the surgery of choice. PSC with cataract, anti-glaucoma medication with surgery, cataract surgery. And in PSCG with advanced glaucoma, combined surgery should be our treatment of choice. So thank you. That's what I.
Thank you, Doctor. Can we have Dr. Devan, sir, please, for your explanation?
Yeah, I think first, let me congratulate both Neetu and Pooja for trying their best to win the debate, but it's not just about winning the debate. One thing is that Manish is there. So Manish, when you had this topic in mind, I think he was referring to only primary glaucoma. So let's not go into secondary glaucoma here. And narrow angle, probably he had only PSC and PSCS in mind. PSCG, mind you, if it is advanced enough, there are enough Synechiae, then laser PI or cataract both may not work up. So you have to combine it with the trap. So let's not go into advanced PSCG. Let's stick to narrow angles, which is PSCS or PSC in my thinking. For this category where there is primarily appositional closure, let me say that both a laser PI and a cataract surgery can do the trick. So as regards the glaucoma control or the IOP control is concerned. So that part is quite even on both fronts. There are two other factors to consider. One is the ocular parameters. So let me tell you, for the benefit of the audience, you just can't say that how thick the lens is, how shallow the AC is. So we have identified at RP Center, the work has identified some basic, the actual numbers. So the risk for when the AC depth is less than 1.8, then it becomes a difficult surgery. The risk of progression is also there. So this is one thing in the AC anterior chamber depth. Second is the length, the axial length. So whenever it is less than 22 in the pre-op, when you've done the biometry, so less than 22, most of our lesser experienced surgeons will struggle. So please keep that in mind. So if that is there is no harm in doing a laser PI. It relieves to some extent the appositional closure and makes your cataract surgery easier and less complicated. Third risk factor in terms of numbers that we've shown is that if the lens thickness is 5 millimeters or more. So in this regard, yes, lot of the experienced, see, I don't do cataract surgery for the last 22 years, but I have a lot of glaucoma patients where my colleagues do the cataract surgery for. And just before the lockdown in Delhi, there was one of the most experienced surgeons I visit, the cataract surgeon. He was struggling because the axial length was 21.5. So this is just to drive home that this thing, that please don't have ego. There is nothing wrong in doing a laser PI if you're less experienced. Your surgery becomes easy, and you are, the medical legal angle is taken care of. They had to do a vitrectomy because the pressure went up so high in that patient in TROP. So keep that in mind. Having said this, if your ocular parameters are not in this range, say the axial length is more than 22, the AC depth is more than 2 millimeters, so on and so forth, then I think doing a laser PI may be a futile exercise beforehand, because most cataract surgeons can manage that much of this thing, and there is hardly any complication, and the angle opens up. You have to consent prehand that if it is PSC, that yes, the patient may need post-op medication to supplement the cataract surgery. So keep that in mind, that you also have to define the ocular parameters. Third thing I partly said is the surgeon experience. So the cataract surgeon experience is a vital this thing. A lot of them take time. They take 20 minutes to do a phaco, even more. So I think then it becomes a struggle for them. Some of them can finish it in 3 minutes. So then it's less of a struggle. The more time you take, it allows more disturbance of the ocular dynamics in TROP and more chances of surgery. So I must congratulate both Neetu and Pooja for trying to drive home their points. But I think in this, you have to really individualize the patient and decide this thing. There cannot be one winner in this, that always you have to do a laser PI. That is not correct. But there are a lot of cases where a laser PI makes your surgery more comfortable if you are more of a beginner or a less experienced. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Before we move on to the next couple of talks, Dr. Pandav, sir, Dr. Janshekhar, any comments on any of the debates which we've had so far?
I think I'll tell at the end of the thing, I'll just probably able to summarize the.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Pandav, sir, anything right now, or can we go ahead?
All the speakers have done justice to their talks, basically, but at this point, I just a couple of points, basically, there's regarding the resurgery, the trabeculectomy or a tube. I think if you have and then you're doing a resurgery, you're doing another surgery which an eye which is already failed. Most of us would prefer that procedure before you go for the tube. But I just want to mention here that instead of doing a full trabeculectomy, there is also a procedure called a revision trab, or trab through a limited posterior revision trab. So there are other procedures also available in such situations, and they can also be kind of considered if you don't want to do a full trabeculectomy. So there are other options as well. And in all these debates, actually, there might be some more options as well, but because the restricted time, I think the speaker is kind of bound by certain things. So, they only focus on, what is the center of the point is. And also, I think regarding laser idotomy, I think Dr. It has all been summarized very nicely, both of these, and also the discussant, Dr. Tulli. I think he has summarized actually the gist of it. So I think we can go ahead to the next section.
There is a question from the audience, Dr. Pandav, that if there is PACS and if no YAC PI is planned, can we still safely dilate for preoperative cataract evaluation and fundus evaluation? Do you have any mantra for that, sir?
PACS is only suspect, and it's unlikely that it will go into angle closure. So we can suspect, but the only caveat here is that whenever you dilate these people, make sure that you check the intraocular pressure afterwards. So,
right, sir.
No, in fact, I can just add to this. In fact, that works like a very good provocative test. So if you can actually do that in the clinic, don't allow the patient to go, like Sir said, you must measure the pressure, say about 1 hour after the dilatation and the procedure is over. And if the pressure is gone up, say beyond 8 to 10 millimeters of mercury, then I think it works like a provocative test. And that means that the patient is likely to have, in that regard, I think it's a good thing to do a laser PI before cataract.
Right, sir. And there's also a question for you, Dr. Devin, that is there any documented cutoff of anterior chamber depth, which for cataract?
No, I think this is a paper which is first authored by Professor Sehota. You could just look up the PubMed and look at this, whoever is asking, or if I get hold of it, the PubMed reference, I'll send it across.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So we'll go ahead now with the next part of the session, where we have Dr. Vijay Shetty, glaucoma specialist from Navi Mumbai, who will be speaking on approach to DISC suspects. So you can start whenever you're ready, sir.
Good evening. Are my slides visible?
Visible and audible both.
Thank you. At the outset, I would like to thank BOA, MOS, and Dr. Manisha for giving me an opportunity to be a part of this session. My topic is approach to DISC suspects. DISC examination helps in distinguishing between healthy glaucoma and non-glaucomatous disc damage. It quantifies the amount of damage, and it also helps in monitoring the change, whether it's stable or worse. It can be done with slit lamp biomicroscope, fundus photography, direct ophthalmoscope, or indirect ophthalmoscope. Axons of the ganglion cells forms the nerve fiber. Approximately 1 million nerve fibers pass through the optic nerve head. Cup is the area in the optic nerve which does not have the nerve fiber. However, cup disc ratio is higher in large disc as there is a larger space to accommodate the axons. And likewise, the cup disc ratio is smaller in small disc. Cup disc ratio is higher in glaucoma due to loss of these axons, which leads to enlargement of the cup. If you have to go only on the cup disc ratio, the right hand side image shows a larger cup than the left-sided image. So which is the abnormal disc? So first we measure the disc size with a slit lamp examination with a 90D or a 60D examination. So anything which is less than 1.65 millimeter is considered a small disc, and anything which is greater than 2.2 millimeter is considered a large disc. And there is a correction factor if you are using any other lens. For example, you use 1.36 correction factor for vertical disc diameter measured when you use a 90D lens. So there are certain fundus camera images which has the ability to measure the disc size as well as in optos. But in other fundus camera images, you can approximately say whether the disc is small or large by comparing the disc size with its distance from the fovea. Now, normal disc size would be, in normal disc size, the distance from the fovea would be around 2.5 disc diameter, whereas in large disc size, it would be around 2 disc diameters. So if you look at the disc, now the left-hand image shows a nerve fiber layer defect, which is more in favor of glaucoma compared to the right-hand image. So if you look at the sensitivity of the vertical cup disc ratio is around 67%, which improves to 76.6% when corrected for the optic disc size. The other one is the Eisen rule, which says inferior rim is greater than superior rim, which in turn is greater than nasal rim and temporal rim. If you look at this disc, here the inferior rim is less than superior rim, which again suggests that it's a glaucomatous disc. Presence of disc hemorrhage in ocular hypertension suggests that there is a higher risk for glaucoma and high risk of converting to glaucoma, and presence of disc hemorrhages in established glaucoma predicts the impending progression. RNFL defect by far is the most reliable sign in diagnosing a glaucomatous disc, which is best seen with a red-free filter. Coming to peripapillary atrophy, it consists of beta zone and alpha zone. Beta zone is adjacent to the disc and it's devoid of retinal pigment epithelium and hence appears whitish. Alpha zone is hyper or hypopigmented area. If you look at this disc, this is the disc margin, this is the beta zone, and this is the alpha zone. Note that the beta zone is larger in the inferior area, which corresponds to the wedge RNFL defect inferiorly, and then again corresponds to the field defects in the superior arcuate area. If you look at the sensitivity of beta zone, it's approximately 50% in diagnosing glaucoma. There are other signs of glaucoma, which are vascular signs as well as laminar dot signs. Certain anomalous discs give us difficulties in making out the glaucomatous disc, like torted disc, tilted disc, and myopic disc. Again, we need to differentiate glaucomatous cupping from non-glaucomatous cupping using a Greenfield's criteria where the age less than 50 years, visual acuity less than 612, pallor more than cupping, and vertically aligned field defects are more suggestive of non-glaucomatous cupping. The other factors like presence of optociliary stent and early involvement of color vision again goes in favor of non-glaucomatous disc damage. Morning glory syndrome and optic disc glaucoma should also be kept in mind when you are looking at the glaucomatous-like picture. How do you approach a patient with this suspect? A detailed history, complete eye examination with gonioscopy is mandatory. An additional perimetry, OCT for glaucoma analysis, disc analysis, and pachymetry is helpful. In the family history of glaucoma, presence of diabetes, trauma, uveitis, sleep apnea syndrome, medication use like steroids and drugs causing angle closure should be noted. Among the drugs causing angle closure, by one mechanism is via pupillary dilatation, and the other mechanism is idiosyncratic reaction, wherein there is a forward movement of the lens iris diaphragm. Toperimetry is typically causes angle closure through this mechanism. Clinical examination consists of refraction to know whether the patient is hypermetropic who are at risk of angle closure glaucoma, external examination for ciliary congestion or presence of hemangiomas, pupil for relative efferent pupillary defect, slit lamp examination for presence of pseudoexfoliation, Krukenberg spindle, presence of evidence of previous trauma including sphincter tear and glaucoma flecken and uveitis. IOP measurement by applanation tonometry. Gonioscopy is a must, and again the dilated examination of the optic disc and retina. If you look at the natural history of the disease, in presence of risk factors, there is an acceleration of the apoptosis leading on to ganglion cell death, and which in turn leads to undetectable RNFL change, which becomes detectable at a later stage, and finally leading on to functional impairment. This functional impairment is detected on perimetry. The detectable RNFL layer change can be documented using red-free filter photograph, but the undetectable RNFL change can be made out on OCT RNFL evaluation, and ganglion cell death can be made out on ganglion cell analysis on OCT. So correlation of the disc features with OCT findings and perimetry helps in confirming glaucoma diagnosis. So this is a typical case who is a 65-year-old male patient with a family history of glaucoma in elder brother, whose IOP was 23 mm of mercury in both eyes with open angles on gonioscopy. The disc in the left eye showed inferior notch with two distinct retinal nerve fiber layer defects in the infratemporal peripapillary area. Humphrey field analyzer showed a correlating defect in the superior hemifield. The defect also was involving the central 10-degree field. So the OCT showed retinal nerve fiber layer thinning in inferior peripapillary region in the RNFL thickness map, deviation map, and clock hour map, correlating with the clinical and Humphrey field analyzer examination. Again, the field defect involving the central 10-degree correlated with the inner retinal layer thinning found in the macula scan. Hence, the disc findings, perimetry, and OCT correlated well in this case. So to summarize, detailed examination of the disc itself in suspicious disc is mandatory. Comprehensive eye examination, including gonioscopy, aids in diagnosis of the type of glaucoma, and correlation of the disc findings with OCT and perimetry helps in confirmation of glaucoma. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we have another talk on uveitic glaucoma by Dr. Sunny Badwani, please. Dr. Sunny, are you here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, very good.
Give me a minute, I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, take your time.
So good evening all. Thank you MOS and BOA for giving me the opportunity. Is my screen visible?
Yeah, go ahead.
So today I will discussing one simple uveitic case. So a 48-year female housewife by occupation was referred for second opinion. So her presenting complaints were diminution of vision since 6 months. It was gradual, progressive, and worsening. Apart from mild redness, she didn't have any complaints. So past history, she was treated elsewhere and report for further management. History of 7 attacks of redness and blurred vision in left eye since past 5 years. Attacks were relieved by anti-glaucoma medications and topical steroids. Her medical history was insignificant except for hypothyroidism. There was no history of any joint pains, morning stiffness. Also, there was no history of any allergic reactions. So currently, she was using Dimox half tablet QID, tablet Ultroxin for hypothyroidism, and locally she was using Predfort eye drops 8 times a day, dorzolamide tumoral combination 2 times a day, and brimonidine eye drop 3 times a day. Her visual acuity was 6.6 N6 in right eye and left eye 6/12 and N8. It was due to cataract. So anterior examination, anterior segment right eye was within normal limit. Left eye shows few small to moderate KPs and few pigmentation inferiorly. Also, there was significant cataract in left eye. So you can see some KPs in left eye inferiorly. They were moderate to small. And gonioscopy was open in both the eyes except for pigmentation in left eye. On fundus examination, the fundus of both eye was fairly within normal limits. Her applanation tonometer was 14 and 16 millimeter of mercury, and pachymetry was 500 microns in both the eyes. So to sum up the findings, it was a case of unilateral recurrent uveitis with open angles. So on the basis of above findings, a differential diagnosis of Posner-Solzhenitsyn syndrome, Fuchs heterochromic cyclitis, sarcoidosis, rheumatoid arthritis, acquired syphilis, Grant syndrome, that is a rare pigmented KPs or trabecular meshwork causes IOP rise, and a rare case, rare chance of TB was assumed. So on some investigations were done. All investigations were normal limits, within normal limits. CBC, ESR, HLA-B27, RA factor, chest X-ray and X-ray of sacroiliac joints, Mann-Tooks test, VDRL, and tests for syphilis were normal. So on clinically, diagnosis of Posner-Solzhenitsyn syndrome was made. So we will discuss mainly of this rare but simple topic of Posner-Solzhenitsyn syndrome. So glaucoma in ocular inflammation may be due to uveitis, scleritis, keratitis, or orbital inflammation. So uveitis in glaucoma, the overall prevalence is 10 to 20%. It is more commonly associated with herpes zoster, herpes simplex, toxoplasmosis, pars planitis, and rheumatoid arthritis. So pathogenesis, it may be due to closed angle or open angle. Closed angle may be due to pupillary block oppositional and synechial closure. It may be due to anterior rotation of lens iris diaphragm, and in cases of late neovascularization. And open angle may be due to trabecular obstruction. It may be due to trabeculitis, scarring of trabecular meshwork. It may be due to steroid induced, and it may be due to prostaglandin mediated. So coming to our case, Posner-Solzhenitsyn syndrome, it was originally described in 1948 by Posner and Scholzman. It is a rare, self-limiting and benign disease. Most common, it is seen most commonly in middle decades, 30 to 60 years old, and possible association by CME virus is also seen. Clinically, it presents as unilateral recurrent attacks of non-granulomatous iritis. Symptoms of mild discomfort, brow ache, halos, and slight blurring of vision are present. The IOP is acutely elevated during the attacks. It ranges between 30 to 70 millimeters of mercury. There is mild conjunctival congestion. Corneal edema can be seen. Scanned KP is present all over the endothelium. The inflammation is traced. Midrace is there in the affected eye. Attacks last few hours to few weeks. The angles are open and the fields and optic discs are fairly normal. In between the attacks, the IOP is normal. There is association between open angle glaucoma and Posner-Solzhenitsyn syndrome, with as many as 45% of PSS patients having concomitant open angle glaucoma. Also, glaucomatous damage from PSS itself has also been seen. The risk of glaucoma developing after 10 or more years of exposure is 2.8 times higher than in those with less than 10 years of the disease. So treatment, usually it is a benign and self-limiting disease, but it is always better to treat for good prognosis, as there is association with open angle glaucoma also. Glaucomatous damage has also been reported. So topical mainstay of treatment are topical steroids and anti-glaucoma medications, except for PG analogs. In a recent study by Wang et al., out of 74 eyes, medical treatment was effective for 62 eyes. 12 eyes exhibited progressive cupping and visual field loss that required trap with mitomycin C. All 12 eyes had not reported further attacks of PSS after surgery. In a brief, PSS is a benign and self-limiting disease, but rarely glaucomatous damage may occur with long-term disease. Hence, patients with Posner-Schwarzman syndrome must have regular evaluation of visual acuity, visual fields, and IOP. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Sunny. And we go to the next talk by Dr. Gayatri Roshi from Kolhapur on normal tension glaucoma, case discussion based, which will be the last topic for the day.
Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
My screen is shared.
Not as yet, ma'am. At least I cannot see it.
Now?
Not yet.
Now?
Now the Zoom link is showing, ma'am. You need to go to your presentation.
Okay. Yeah.
You can maximize it and you can start, ma'am.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. At the outset, I would like to thank BOA and MOS for inviting me. I'll be talking about normal tension glaucoma, a few cases that we routinely see in our OPD, and sometimes we may just not look into the detailing of the disease. This was a case of a 57-year-old male. This is a very routine case who had come for a checkup. On examination, his visual acuity was 6.6 and 6. Slit lamp was normal. Intraocular pressures were around 16 in both the eyes, and CCT was 500 and 506 microns in right and left eye, respectively. The angles were open. Optic disc evaluation showed a right eye was normal, but the left eye showed an inferior notch with a wedge defect. So fields was done. For the right eye was normal, but left eye, it definitely showed some defects here, which were nearing the fixation. Very typical for a normal tension glaucoma. What was done was a diurnal measurement. IOP was done. Minimum of 13 in the right eye and 16 in the left eye, and maximum was around 15 to 17. So this was a very typical case of normal tension glaucoma. Points in favoring were a normal IOP, asymmetric cup, disc and field changes, which were correlating. So the patient was started on prostaglandin analogs and is being maintaining. Now that was quite a clear-cut case, but in this patient, 37-year-old male, he was a diabetic and hypertensive, under treatment and under control, was being treated elsewhere for a normal tension glaucoma with brimonidine eye drops in both the eyes. This was where the patient was earlier being treated by a general ophthalmologist. His vision was 6.6 M6, then applanation was 16 and 12 in the left. Gonioscopy was open. Right eye, the disc showed 0.7 and inferior and superior in thinning, and left eye was 0.5. CCT was normal. I do not have the disc photographs because the patient was being treated somewhere else. These were his field defects during the first visit over there. Showed some earlier superior defects, though they are quite unreliable. 10 months later, when the patient had reviewed with that ophthalmologist, the best corrected visual acuity was 6.6 and 6. Applanation was again 16 with medication. Disc was the same, and CCT and CCT2 was same. However, that person had again repeated the fields, and this was what happened in the right eye. The doctor suspected some progression and hence was referred to me. So this is the first visit and this is the second visit of the patient. About 10 months gap definitely shows some changes, though the fields are unreliable. Would like to repeat the fields to say a progression, but yes, something was happening there. So then I did a disc photograph, and these other disc photographs when the patient had come to me. what I did was a diurnal variation, and what we found out that the 16 pressure, which was pressures which was supposed to be normal by the doctor on medication. However, during a diurnal, the right eye showed a change of 24 and left eye 20, highest IOP. So the patient was switched to a bimatoprost eye drops in both the eyes. After 1 week, I repeated the pressures, preferably this time at 8 o'clock. It is easier because it is a small city. We can call the patients in the early timing over here. And the pressures were like 16 and 14. Now the patient is maintaining a pressures of around 12, and so I would like to stress that in spite the patient is being treated for normal tension glaucoma, and if you are suspecting some field changes, it is always better to repeat a diurnal in that, even if the patient is undergoing treatment. Now this was the this is a third case, a 50-year-old male, no specific complaints, but he had a family history of glaucoma and he had come for a checkup because he had a family history. He was borderline hypertensive, not on any treatment. These were his findings. Vision was normal, anterior segment normal, IOP was 18. His angles were open, healthy rim 0.6, 500 microns CCT. These were the discs. They were quite normal in both the eyes. Did not show any defects. Fields were normal when the patient had first consulted. So patient, it was an option whether to treat or not. The patient was quite aware, and so we thought that we will not treat him and get him for a regular follow-up. He came for the first year, second year, but then afterwards he came after 3 years. And then this was what we found. The disc had showed in the right eye showed a superior wedge defect. Left eye also the same. There was a superior wedge defect in the left eye. So a swap was done and we could see an inferior defect in the right eye and some defects in the left eye. So considering thinner corneas and family history, we started him on a prostaglandin analog. Target pressures were like to be maintained for less than 15, and now the patient is on a regular follow-up, maintaining his fields and IOP are now stable. So when we have such patients of normal tension glaucoma, I would like to emphasize on that it is a diagnosis of exclusion. So we have to rule out all other causes of glaucoma or any other of disc damage, like previously told by Dr. Vijay Shetty. We have to go in for a diurnal fluctuation to just see whether there is any wide fluctuation and we are not missing any POAGs. We have to ask the patient whether the patient is on any systemic medications, has had used any steroids earlier, or whether the patient is a case of burnt out pigmentary old glaucomas, whether past uveitic or trauma patient. Also, we should evaluate the disc if it has had any trauma or if it is an optic disc pit, any toxic neuropathies, anemias, or any sudden acute blood loss. So while evaluation, we should take a proper history, any eye disease for migraine, current medications, any coagulopathies, sleep apnea and nocturnal hypotension. That must be emphasized because many times the patients take antihypertensive at night and then they have a dip and that causes any progression, may cause progression in the disease. So to take home message, whenever patients with normal tension or suspicious disc, glaucomatous discs come, we have to be very particular about the ocular examination, perform CCT, perform a diurnal even during the first visit and even during, maybe you can perform some other time also after 3-4 years or whenever you feel that there is any progression or the patient is not doing how you want him to go. If you look for the other risk factors, close and meticulous follow-up, extensive systemic workup in patients who are more than 60 years, like if there is, especially the optic disc pallor is more than the cupping or the rapid progression in spite of your treatment. Thorough systemic examination, including medical history, neurological examination, any carotid Doppler or angiography if required to see whether there is any non-arthritic ischemic neuropathy playing a role, any blood or a CBC for hematocrit and ESR, and a CT or MRI if required. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gayatri. Dr. Manisha has had a question that in place of diurnal variation testing, is there a role for water drinking test as a provocative test? Because there are some studies in this regard. Do you have any experience on the same which you would like to enlighten us?
Yeah, we can also do water drinking test. It has been proved that water drinking also increases the pressures once you do. But I feel that a diurnal is much better. At least we get a clear-cut idea like how is the phase, what are the phases, and at what time the patient increases the pressure increases in the eye. so that maybe we can even manage our treatment doses also or the medicine also accordingly.
Right, right. Can you stop sharing your screen, please?
Yeah.
Any other program in this after this, or because
no, sir, we are at the end of the session, sir. We can do a little bit of discussion if people if it's possible.
We only have finished allocated time, but we can continue for some more time if you have any questions.
Ganeshan, sir, your opinion, please, if you want to opine about on any of the topics.
Dr. Vidya as well, Dr. Reena as well, our convener and co-convener. If you can please switch on your video so we can hear your inputs as well, please.
Regarding the first case, that was the uveitis patient. Maybe I missed it or something. Did this patient also has cataract? Posterior subcapsular cataract?
Yeah.
I saw that was quite blurry in the.
Yes, yes. She was having dense nuclear fibrosis as well as PSC cataract in the left eye.
Only why did she get cataract?
Maybe due to repeated use of steroids in the past. Maybe due to inflammation.
This could also
Dr. Pandav, you're not audible, sir. Can you just be a little louder if you don't mind, please? Thank you.
Diagnosis. Fuchs uveitis actually that is present. However, the spikes are much more in the partial sources. The characters of the KPs will be a little different, but
yes.
Also depends on what time. I think it again comes down to the proper history. So if
yes.
Minimal inflammation, actually, the posterior slots, the inflammation is minimum and it lasts only for some time. But if you have, posterior subcapsular cataract and, KPs that are persisting, you might have to think in terms of an alternative diagnosis. And Fuchs is quite often missed, and that may not have its, typical heterochromia seen in all patients because of the, because we have dark, iris pigmentation already there. So I think I would also consider that diagnosis in the patient.
Yes.
There's a situation where the patient has got secondary angle closure glaucoma with raised anterior posterior diameter. He's not in the position to undergo immediate lens extraction. What will be the role of PI and how would one approach? Anybody?
You want me to?
Anybody would be fine, like any of the panelists.
Before I comment, I think doing a laser iridotomy is doesn't do much harm, I would say. So if you have any doubt of whether you do it or not do, it's better to err on the side of doing it rather than not doing it. There's no clear-cut cutoff parameters actually. If you look at the ocular biometry in the lens thickness, or nowadays they look at the dome of the lens or the vault of the lens on anterior segment OCT. That probably is of whether closure. But these parameters actually, there's no mathematics there. There's no there's no set formula that if the ratio is much, you're going to end up into trouble. These things are only indicatives. So if you have anterior side, chamber depth less than 8 millimeters of mercury, then the relative risk is higher. That's I would say, and it's not that it's very important. But the only thing is that if you find in a situation where the relative risk is higher, so if the lens dome is bigger, lens vault is bigger, or the lens thickness is bigger, then the primary problem is somewhere with the lens rather than other things. So there you would focus on removing the lens. If there's a cataract, there's a you can make it an indication for early removal of the lens. But if a lens vault is normal and if a lens thickness is normal, and then you look at the anterior, like that proportion of the axial length and the anterior chamber depth. Again, there's no clear-cut criteria there again. But again, if if the ratio is disturbed, then again you look more in terms of doing a laser iodotomy. Perhaps if the lens is not really playing a role, then you will think in more in terms of a pupillary block element. So there are, I think, is also the configuration of the anterior segment, which is again important. So there's no one parameter which is absolute, but sometime I like to do, anterior segment OCT, or more often like UBM, actually, to look at the configuration of that area, how the relationship of the peripheral cornea with the iris and the ciliary body is, that and the lens, of course. So that gives you a little much more idea about the anatomy of that region, and that can be better guide for deciding what you want to do or you don't want to do. So like on UBM, if you see the peripheral iris is very close to the cornea, or there's a iris Bombay configuration, or if there's a plateau iris kind of configuration, so you kind of have some guide to decide. So if you have a iris Bombay kind of configuration, those are the cases where laser iodotomy should be done, right? But if you don't have that kind of configuration, then laser iodotomy may not be useful. Okay, so I think that's how I would approach these.
Thank you, sir.
So I have one question, sir, in the context of a patient of normal tension glaucoma who is steadily progressing despite pressures being in low teens consistently noted. You have ruled out non-IOP risk factors of nocturnal hypotension, carotid angiography, etc., and you're not really finding anything positive. Yet patient is progressing. How easy or difficult is it for you to think of a TRAB in that case? And if so, any modifications do you make compared to when you do a TRAB for a high pressure or a primary open angle glaucoma in these cases, sir?
I think that's a little difficult to answer, and also because the situation is difficult, and sometimes we do see cases where you have a glaucoma which is progressing, and the IOP is in the low teens, and you don't really know what to do in those situations, because but the first thing you already said is that you said yourself is to like rule out other factors, and I think one of the speakers on the NTG also spoke that you rule out the other risk factors, and it was hypotension, nocturnal hypertension, or sleep apnea is something which we miss, and patients also do not actually complain unless you really probe them, poke them into in the details of the history. So that could be one of the factors which we have to take care of. But if nothing is there and the glaucoma is still progressing, do look into other factors also. There are some nutritional aspects. Are they smokers, or any vascular other vascular pathology, or is there smoking, or is there any B12 or some vitamin deficiency? Sometimes they are also contributing factors which we don't ask for them, but I think in one odd case you'll see that those are also responsible. But I think then the question of whether you want to do trabeculectomy to reduce further IOP or not, I think that actually is a bit of a tricky question, and there's no clear answer for that. But if there's nothing else is there, then probably you would like to reduce the pressure to less than 10 at least to 9-10 millimeters of mercury range, and with the hope that that will stop the progression. But there's no guarantee, because if you have a glaucoma which is progressing at 10 to 12 millimeters of mercury range, or 12 in that range, but will stop progressing at 8 to 10 millimeters of mercury range, again is just you hope that will happen. But I have seen cases where I have reduced pressures to 7, 8, 9 millimeters of mercury range, and glaucoma continued to progress, and I didn't find any cause whatsoever after extensive investigation. So those situations also happen sometimes, but definitely. So this is a bit of a decision which you will have to talk to the patient and kind of inform him that we are doing, with the hope that reducing pressures to under lower than 10 would help. But there are two things here. Again, number one, there's no guarantee that what your surgery is going to end up with that kind of pressures, because titrating pressures that precisely after trabeculectomy is not easy, and you could end up with a hypertony, or could still end up with the pressure which are more than 10 millimeters of mercury. So that's one that has to be discussed with the patient. And second aspect again is that even if you achieve your target IOP, whether the glaucoma is controlled or the progression stops or not, that again cannot be guaranteed. So this is a territory which is actually difficult, I would say, and so it has to be a very considered decision either way. But if there's nothing else, is working, then obviously you don't want to see your patient losing vision, and you don't do anything. So definitely I would, reduce the pressure further in these patients, and also look at other factors, giving some supportive treatment.
In this situation, can we go a little less aggressive, like start with SLT and then progress, or go for an invasive procedure or something like that?
Absolutely. So I kind of take it that way, that you have tried everything, to reduce pressure to below to say 10, 11, 12 millimeters of mercury range. And drugs, SLT, whatever.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Chandrasekhar, Dr. Ragini, Dr. Manish, sir, Swapnesh, please, any comments, anything which you want to end the session with?
Yeah, see, when we were students, we were taught all the glaucoma, open angle glaucoma, depends on one side, the tension, ocular tension. The other side, it depends on the vascularity. So it is all the glaucomas fall in between these two. That's why, in spite of doing, active medical treatment, surgery, on one side, the glaucoma progresses, even if you control the pressure to even less than 10 and all those things, because those things are totally dependent on vascularity. So the other side, where what we tackle is the ocular pressure. That is what we can tackle maximum by bringing down the pressure. That's what we used to think, and
Yeah, I think sometimes these glaucoma also progress because of other factors, like IOP is, of course, there's the focus, but sometimes other factors are also there. It could be the compliance related factor or, associated conditions. I think we need to, when you have a progression which is not explained on the IOP basis, then you have to look into compliance, because sometimes the patient, they come to you, they are compliant on those particular days and your pressure is good, but in between they may not be compliant. So I think you have to rule out that factor as well. And of course, other things we have already kind of discussed.
Do we have any questions? Any more questions for the panelists and the experts?
Dr. Lahane, sir. Dr. Ragini, ma'am. Manish, sir.
It's end of the day, so yeah,
Dr. Lahane, sir?
At the end of the day, should we formally conclude the session?
Yeah, I think so, because we have already
conclude the session.
I think the session was very good discussion, and thank you very much, Pandav sir. बहुत अच्छा discussion हुआ. It was very good. Chandrasekhar sir, the this Mayav sir, the Jinis was, and everybody took part in that, and all the faculty. It means it was a, you can say yes or no, but I think it was a good discussion. I was hearing the discussion, and yes. Then I think you can conclude, Pandey sir. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all the chairpersons, especially Dr. Pandav, Dr. Chandrasekhar, Pratik sir, Devin sir, and rest of the speakers. Special thanks to Lahane sir, Ragini ma'am, Dr. Preetham, Dr. Savan, Dr. Manish Shah, Dr. Nikhil Gokhale, Dr. Sumit Lahane, Dr. Himalini Sam, and other members of scientific committee for giving us another wonderful day of this academic feast. Till we meet again on next Sunday. Thank you, everybody. And
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Everybody. Thank you,
Good evening.
Manish.
Good
Thank you,
night.
Manish.
Big thank you to
everybody.
Manish sir.
Thank you.
Big
Thank you
to
very
Manish
much.
sir.
It has been a very good session all through the day. Lots of knowledge being shared, and I'm sure everybody has benefited, including me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Manish.
you. Thank you,
Thank you,
sir, and
Pandav sir.
you,
Thank you,
Ragini.
Chandrasekhar sir. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.